Hello, everyone. It's about 5 minutes before we're going to start our session. I'll be switching my phone on silent. If you haven't joined us yet, or you're just thinking about joining us, you've still got time to get on the session before we start with the live Q&A for process safety management. I'll see you guys in a minute. At about 2 minutes to I'll start the session. Hello, welcome to those of you who've just joined us. We'll be starting the session in a couple of minutes for Process Safety Management, Process Safety Forum. So get your questions ready, and as always, make sure that you're familiar with the Q&A function. So if you use the Q&A function, I can answer the questions live. Otherwise, I'll check the chat at the end in case there's some questions I haven't answered. Hi, everyone. For those of you who've just joined us, I'm just going to start now with the introduction for the Process Safety Forum. So if you haven't attended before, you'll know what to expect. Can you just ping me a message on the chat to let me know that you can hear me okay and see me okay? Sorry, I'm just making sure I've got all my windows. Great. Can you see my screen okay? Great. Excellent. So hopefully when I do this, it will stay on the same screen. Yep. So we are joined tonight for the Process Safety Forum for Process Safety Management. Again, remember that this session is being streamed live to YouTube. So, and it will be available for playback. So just be mindful of what you say and be respectful. Anybody who's offering advice on the session, including myself, we're all volunteers and we're just offering what we have learned in our years of experience. So what is the Process Safety Forum? It's a place to get access to industry experts and ask questions on specific topics once per month. We generally catch up every first Wednesday of each month at 8 p.m. UK time, and it's available for catch up on YouTube afterwards on my channel, Process Safety with Louise. It's supported by a masterclass once a month. So the masterclass for this session was held on the 20th of January and will be available in my shop if you want to watch it afterwards. And also supported by other content on LinkedIn. So if you follow me on LinkedIn, you may have seen the other content today, this month. And it's a place for all of us to share best practices and learn. I know that every time I run one of these process safety forums, I learn something from you guys. So please share your best practices with myself and the other participants so that we can all improve our performance. So what are we going to talk about tonight? We're going to be talking about process safety management, which actually means that you can ask me a question about just about anything. We're going to start now at 8 o'clock with a quick introduction to the topic and to the presenter. So I'll give myself a quick introduction in case you haven't been on one of these before. And then at 10 past 8, I'm going to be opening the floor for questions. As I said just a few minutes ago, if you want to start asking questions as I go through the material in the first 10 minutes, pop them in the Q&A. And as soon as the questions come up, I'll start answering them. If you put them in the chat, I'll be looking at that after the session. So, you know, as the session's starting to run to a close. So if you want your questions answered, the best thing to do is to put them in the chat, in the Q&A. And then about 5 minutes before we close the session at 9 o'clock, I'll wrap up and announce next month's topic. A brief introduction. So my name's Louise Whiting, and I'm an independent process safety engineer providing freelance services across many different industries. You can find out more at my website, louisewhiting.com. And basically, I run these sessions to try and help people all around the world who maybe don't have access to free process safety information. So what is process safety management? Well, there's lots of different ways to manage process safety, but there's two main industry recognized process safety management frameworks. There are others, and if you look on the LinkedIn posts this month, you'll see some comments about people sharing best practices from other areas of the world. The two that I'm familiar with are the Center for Chemical Process Safety. They have a 20-element a process safety management system, and it is recommended by OSHA to follow the process safety management system from the CCPS to meet the regulatory requirements. The Energy Institute also have a 20-element system. There are some similarities between the two, but there are also some differences. I use the Energy Institute one generally, unless I'm working in America, then I use the CCPS one, because the Energy Institute documentation is available for free to any members of the Energy Institute. And so therefore it makes it a lot more accessible to myself and to clients to be able to get the supporting information that you need. It's also got a really great framework for identifying leading and lagging indicators, and also for how to implement these process safety elements into your organization. So what is process safety management about? Yeah, okay, so there's two, CCPS, Energy Institute, but what does it mean? It's generally split into about 5 areas, and it depends on the framework you use, whether they group them or whether they just have the 20 elements separately. They generally have an area of culture and management instruction. So this is kind of giving you the feel for how process safety is done here. And it's kind of the things that you will accept in your organization. For example, if the culture at your organization is that we are really keen on slip, trips, and falls, and we want to keep the place tidy, but if we have a fire, we feel like that wasn't something we could foresee, then that's setting the scene for the culture at your facility. Other facilities are really hot on process safety management. We don't have a loss, but perhaps housekeeping is not as good. So there's lots of different aspects to the process safety culture. With regards to the culture, there's also things about whether people feel safe to talk up, whether they whether they feel safe to challenge if something isn't going right, whether there are budgetary pressures, regulatory pressures. All of these things form part of this culture part. So the regulations, the standards you follow, and then how actually your leadership behave is the first element. The next one is your process safety information. So this is the information that you hold about your facility, which tell you if you are inside your design or operating envelopes, whether you are going to be safe, what are the potential consequences if things go wrong, and how should you recover from incidents that happen at your facility. The next one, which often comes before the process safety information, but depends on what stage you are in your facility, is the risk identification and assessment. This is the cornerstone for process safety management. If you do not identify the hazard and assess it correctly, you cannot manage it. If you don't know you have the problem, how can you even begin to fix it? Okay, so risk identification and assessment is the cornerstone for the whole of process safety management. Without good support from the culture, you might not have the time to assess it. Without good process safety information, you may be making decisions on poor information. Without good process safety information after the risk assessment, you may not be managing it very effectively. So, but if you don't identify it, you have no chance at all. And then we have the management of the risk. So once we have identified the risk, we then have to manage it. So how in practice will we make sure that this risk is not realized? Okay, so this is what these are. And this is typically where you get the management of change, your permit to work, your safe isolations. All of those good practices are generally in this management of risks. And then the last one is continuous improvement. Often people don't see incident investigation as continuous improvement, but it really is. It's an opportunity to learn from what's gone wrong in the past, whether it's a near miss or whether it was an actual incident, and then feedback and improve the other stages of your process safety management system. You need the right culture to be able to accept those improvements, etc. But your continuous improvement is a key element to your process safety management. The last slide is process safety is not easy. Okay, they can be super complicated, and the reason is because it touches almost every aspect of your facility. If you have a high hazard facility, it covers how people behave during that managing of the high hazard. It covers the information that you hold in your facility. It covers each part of your facility that has potential for loss of containment. It covers the management. It covers everything, how you access people, get access to the facility, how you train them before they come on the facility, how you respond to emergencies. All of those things are covered in process safety management. So it is complicated, but it can often seem a lot more complex than it needs to be. And this is because it is covering several departments. It's usually developed over time as we adapt after incidents and after standards change. And as a result of it developing over time, sometimes it hasn't grown up in the best way possible. So you might have a part here and then suddenly realize, oh, you need a step before. So you kind of try and wedge it here. And then you realize, oh, you need some more steps here. And then as you go on, you get all these different steps, and they're not really talking to each other in the best way. It can be difficult to get an overview of your process safety management system, especially when it's managed by several different people and there is not one single focal point who knows what's happening in all the parts. The best performance I have seen for a process safety management system is where you have one single focal point for the whole of process safety management. Now, that doesn't mean that they are the people who decide who do the risk-based inspection, and they're not the same person who approves all the permits, but it is one person who knows what's happening in all those elements, the health of all those elements, and how they're working together, and can give instruction to all those people as how their part interacts with other parts of the process safety management system. So that's it for the presentation today. I'm going to end the slideshow and stop presenting. I've had a couple of questions come in, so I'll answer the first one. So does the 14 elements process safety management standard developed by OSHA is still a good framework to follow from my point of view, it's very clear and straightforward to implement with my organization. So all process safety management systems are good as long as you apply them and they are holistic. The reason why I recommend the CCPS is because it is a risk-based process safety management system rather than a compliance-based process safety management system. I'm not that familiar with the OSHA one, but what I do know is that OSHA in general is a compliance-based framework. And so therefore, if there's a requirement for you to have vents routed to safe locations 20 meters from the facility, you will do that 20 meters from the facility. Even if the hazard, which you could have released from that vent, means that you should actually have it placed 40 meters from the facility, you will replace it 20 meters because that is the regulatory requirement, unless you've done a thorough risk assessment and you've decided to go more than the requirement. So the reason why I suggest the CCPS or the Energy Institute is because they're risk-based. You have a look at the risks on your facility and you decide what those risks are and you decide how to manage those. And it's about demonstrating that you have this process to identify, assess, and manage the hazards that you have at your facility. So I hope that's answered your question. I've got another question here from Mustafa. How can we marry between asset integrity and process safety? And does asset integrity a big umbrella? So actually the umbrella is process safety management. The process safety management incorporates asset integrity. And this is all about how you are managing your hazards. So you need to have really good, as I said before, process information about your facility. Your process information about your facility will include things like your inspection reports, which are part of your asset integrity. They will include things like how many safety critical overrides there are, how many wraps you have on your facility. All of those things which are part of your asset integrity form part of a larger process safety management system. Also, the other thing that you will have in your process safety management system, which forms part of your asset integrity, is your inspection regime, and that comes under how you're managing your risk. So what I would say actually is the process safety management system is the umbrella, because it also covers things like culture, like learning from incidents, and those things are not covered generally by your asset integrity system. And also your asset integrity system doesn't generally cover things like operating practices, like your maintenance procedures, and also your permit to work, which are, and your emergency response. Those are not normally covered by your asset integrity program. So process safety is the more overarching, and asset integrity is a element of that process safety management system. So I've had a question from Alan. Is there any guidance on developing continuous improvement plans specifically for process safety management rather than occupational safety management? Yeah, so there's some really good guidance. I think it's HSC 254, which is about key performance indicators and looking for leading key performance indicators. With regards to process safety management, it is a little bit difficult to identify a sort of one size fits all, because the process safety management system needs to be specific for the hazards at your facility. And so I might have nitrogen and I might have liquefied nitrogen. For example, the incident that we saw this week at the poultry factory in the US. So they were using liquid nitrogen to freeze the chicken. They had recently changed over from an ammonia-based system to the liquid nitrogen system. And somehow in that change, something wasn't adequately assessed and they have had an incident. The CSB are still investigating. We don't know what the cause is, but we know that they were using one system. They changed over to a nitrogen system, and a year later they've had an incident, which was a result of asphyxiation. So looking at that facility compared to, say, another chicken facility, you would have very specific hazards associated with the potential for asphyxiation, the potential for cold burns, all of those things associated with handling nitrogen and liquefied nitrogen need to be built part of your process safety management system. Whereas if you don't freeze the chicken and maybe you just cut it and process it, you have other systems which are managing your process safety management there. for example, you may have you may be using things which have high pressures or high temperatures, or you may be using CO2 to keep the atmosphere neutral so that there's no potential for growth. So there's lots of different ways of managing your process safety management, managing process safety depending on your hazards. And that's why I like the HSC guidance, so because they give you a way of breaking up your process, identifying key performance indicators, leading and lagging, and looking at both sides of the bow tie. So looking at the initiators and your mitigative events. I hope that answered your question, Alan. So I have another question from Dragos. Process safety management should be managed by a dedicated department or can be included in some other bigger departments. If it will be a dedicated department, usually how many people should be part of it? So process safety is something that everyone should do. As I've said in the presentation, it touches every aspect of your facility. The key is to have one person who knows how all of these different departments interact with process safety management and how that comes up together to make a safe facility. Now, I've worked on facilities where this process safety team is 10 people. And I've worked on facilities where this process safety team is one person. Okay, the key is not about the number of people. The key is about the competence in that team, and also the ability to influence management's key decisions, which are associated with process safety management. If your team is not able, if you have a team of 20 people, but none of them are able to talk to the front line as well as talking to management, then you could have 100 people. It doesn't matter. You will have poor process safety management because they are not able to convey the importance of the process safety management up the line to influence the decisions which are impacting your process safety. Likewise, they need to be able to talk to the front line to be able to tell them what they need to do. So they need to be able to communicate in a clear and concise way what the hazards are and what the control measures are going to be for those hazards. So to answer your question, it depends on your structure, how your competency is split up, but the key is to have one central place where you know how all of these parts fit together, and to have one person, and that person may have another job, they may not just do process safety management, but have one person who understands how all of these moving parts of process safety management fit together. Okay, and what I have found very useful, even in areas where we don't require a safety case, is to use a safety case to bring all of this information about process safety management into one place so that everybody knows how we do process safety here. It's not just held in one person. And then that person, if they move on to a new role, can hand over very effectively to someone new about how process safety is done here and how to manage the hazards. So I hope that comprehensively answered your question. I have another question from Abdul. As a fresh graduate of mechanical engineering with experience with renewables, how best do I go about a career in process safety and loss prevention engineering? So on Friday, we're going to be having our first careers event. So Nick will be joining us from Six Engineering, and he was previously an engineering recruiter, and he specialized in process safety management. So he will be there to give us some tips on how to structure our CVs and how to talk to people in this time if you may be looking for a job, or if you're looking to change industry or discipline. I will be there providing some advice on my career and how I changed from a process engineer to being a process safety engineer, and what are the key aspects I feel in process safety management. And also talking about the different types of roles you can have in process safety, because there's a lot of different things you can do. So it's quite difficult to answer your question, Abdul, without knowing what part of process safety it is that you're interested in doing and what your timeline is. For example, do you want to be facilitating HazOps in 10 years, or do you want to try and build competence so that you can go out and have a quantitative risk assessment company doing QRAs all the time? So there's a lot of different areas you can go into. It depends on what you want to do. And I'll explain a little bit more of that on Friday afternoon. and then with the different types of roles, and then Nick will help us thinking about how we represent ourselves adequately in the market so that we can secure our follow-on roles. And it's also, there's some really good guidance from the Engineering Council on your CPD, your continuous development plan. And if you go through that, that's helping you look at where you are now, where you want to be, and then assessing the gaps and figuring out a way to close them. So that's also really useful to use when you're trying to answer these types of questions. Okay, so I have another question from Alan. Have you experienced any instances of the OSHA PSM element of trade secrets being contentious? Is this a quirk of the US legal culture, and is it relevant in a non-US environment? I have had experience of process safety areas being trade secret. So for example, the incidents that we learn the most from in the industry are those from BP, because BP has a policy of sharing openly everything that was found throughout the investigation. But most companies do not have that, and they feel that the reason they can't share this information is because it will impact their ability to trade or their ability to continue to operate their facility, because people will know how terrible whatever element it was of their performance was, or how their management was poorly structured, or something about it. And so they apply this, not necessarily trade secrets, but another word, which means that they don't need to share all the information about what happened about the incident. I think it depends on if you're looking at post-incident or if you're just looking at sharing best practices. It's really difficult actually to share best practices between organizations, because organizations can be concerned that when individuals are speaking about process safety or other things, that they are representing the company. And, you know, unless you are the expert on that in the company, there may be some gaps in your understanding of how to do things, which is why I use this forum to try and share openly things that that I've learned. And it's not necessarily the way I would have done it in the previous companies I've worked or with any of my specific clients. It's just the way that I would do it rather than a specific company. So I think trying to share things as openly as possible, Alan, if you can. And if there is this kind of trade secrets and you can't share, I think there are key things that we need to know. So for example, if they say, well, we can't share the information about this chemical because it's a trade secret. For example, in the pharmaceuticals, there's quite a lot of that. Well, we need certain properties to be able to manage it safely. We need the ignition, we need the explosion, you know, whether it can be stored in a dry powder or a wet powder, a liquid form, whether it can react with acids, bases, etc. Can it form a toxic gas? All of those sort of things are the things you need to know. You don't necessarily need to know the chemical structure, but you need to know how it interacts with all these things. Is it compatible with PTFE? Is it going to cause solids if it reacts with certain things? Those are the types of questions that I would, if we're facing this kind of secrets statements, is okay, well, forget, I don't need to know all of everything about what you've got. I just need to know these things so that I can help you manage your process safety on your facility. I've got a question from Mustafa. Would you kindly shed a light on the differences between offshore safety case and onshore safety report? So the difference is there's not really that much difference. In the UK, they are administered by two different departments. And so they are also called two different things. One is called a case for safety, which is the offshore one. And the other one is called a COMA report, which is the onshore one. With regards to their intent, they both intend to demonstrate to the regulator that the facility that you are asking to operate is safe. And if it is not safe, well, you know, it's safe because I've identified all these hazards and these are the things that I'm going to do to manage them. And this is what I'll do if things go wrong. And so therefore I feel it's safe. The main difference between an offshore and an onshore report is the assessment of Societal effects. So in an offshore safety case, you are very unlikely to be sufficiently close to the adjacent platform so that your platform can have an impact on your adjacent platform, i.e. it can cause an explosion, overpressure, or the radiation can set fire to the walls or whatever. Okay, so it's very unlikely to be sufficiently close to cause that. However, when you're onshore, you may very well be sufficiently close not only to other industrial units, but also to homes, to roads, to rivers or waterways, which may be supplying people with their drinking water. There's potential for ground contamination again, and that may be leading to the groundwater, which is then supplying people for drinking for their homes. So for me, the biggest difference between the offshore and the onshore is about how you manage the hazards, because the consequences can be quite different. The consequences are not just for your site, your own site. The consequences can also be for other individuals who are off your site. And also for onshore safety reports, you need to consider more closely the stakeholder management, because your facility can be seen by the public. And so therefore there may be questions from the public about your facility and how you manage your hazards, etc. Whereas people may not give that same scrutiny to facilities that are offshore because they can't see them and they're not in their backyard and they're not going to impact them. So those are the kind of differences that I'd see between those. But in general, they both intend to identify your major hazards on your facility. That's both safety and environmental. And then it looks at how you're going to prevent those from happening. And in the event that those preventions don't work, how you're going to manage the fallout to keep everybody safe and minimize the impact to the environment, people, asset, if you like, but it doesn't have to be in the cases. And then, like I say, they are submitted to two different regulators, so they can have a different structure, but the intent is the same. We want you to demonstrate that you have identified how you're going to identify your risks, assess them adequately, and put in ways to manage them. I don't have any more questions at the moment. Alan's confirmed that the HSE guidance is 254 for the key performance indicators. And as I said, I did a session in December for the masterclass. So Alan, I don't know if you'd be interested in that. I used the guidance from the HSE to assess two scenarios and build the key performance indicators, both the leading and the lagging. I'll have a look to see if we've had any questions in the chat. So I've had a question: how can we assess human factors in a process safety incident? So assessing human factors is often the easiest part of assessing a process safety incident, because if you just ask one question, why did it happen? Then you'd probably get, oh, because a person X did Y, right? But if you stop asking the question there, you've really lost an opportunity to learn. And I think what you're referring to here is the deeper part. So why did he do X? Why did he decide to turn that valve instead of the other valve, resulting in loss of containment? Why did he isolate that system at that point? So that's when the human factors start to come in. Oh, well, it's because we had system 1, system 3, and system 2, and he got confused between 2 and 3, and he isolated 3 instead of 2. Then you're starting to get down to the human factors of process safety management. The techniques to use to incident investigation are the same for process safety management as they are for incidents of occupational health. You don't stop at the first answer. You just keep going. One of the techniques is called the 5 whys. You ask why did this happen? You get the first answer. Why did that person do that? Why did that happen? Why did that happen? And I can guarantee you, if you don't come back to a design cause as being one of the contributors, you haven't asked enough questions. Because as design engineers, we set up how the facility is going to be operated in the future. And if we don't assess identify and assess the hazards correctly, we are basically setting operations up for failure. And there will always be a reason why the operators did what they did, which may be because they had time pressures, because they didn't have enough resources. But actually, if you look back, there will probably be an engineering reason. But potentially we didn't give them the right tools. Maybe they had to build scaffolding. Maybe the valves weren't labeled. Maybe the instruments were not the right ones for the duty. So always try to get back to a design reason as well as a operations reason. I think the biggest challenge comes, Nicola, is that when you are trying to look at how human factors happens in the design, because a lot of the people who are involved in the design have never worked in a facility before. And so it can be very difficult for them to identify how the human part of what we do plays into the design and then make improvements in the design. So I've got another question from Greg here. With increased financial constraints of this new area, are you seeing more pressure to under-evaluate the risk from higher management? Greg, I'm not seeing that pressure necessarily as a result of the financial constraints right now. I have seen that pressure since the start of my career. People want to make sure that we don't have any risks in the red box, because red means bad. And we need everything in the green box. And so therefore, if you've assessed it to be in the red box, it must surely be wrong. But actually, a lot of the facilities we manage, they have high severity consequence potential incidents. That doesn't mean that they're very likely, because we've managed them to be less likely. But by artificially lowering the severity of the consequences, you're not really going to put the right safeguards in. So for example, if I assess that if I stick my finger in the socket, I am going to get a very minor shock because the electrical switchboard will isolate. Okay, well, somebody comes to me and they say, I'm going to build a new house. What's the severity of sticking the finger in the socket? I say, oh, it's a minor shock, no problem. I say, okay, well, then they're trying to save money and they think, okay, well, why do I need this big switchboard thing? She said it's only going to be a minor injury. I forgot to tell them the reason why it's only a minor injury is because I assumed they had the switchboard. So they cut the switchboard out. Then all of a sudden someone touches the socket and they die. And they come back and say, well, you didn't say that somebody could die. And I said, well, did you install the switchboard? So the best thing to do with regards to consequences, always do it without safeguards to the fullest degree, which can feel unnatural, especially when you feel like you have safeguards that you can really rely on. But try and do it to the fullest degree and then evaluate your safeguards. So there's potential for fatality as a result of touching the switch. I have the switchboard, it has high integrity, it's tested once a year. Is that sufficient? Yes, it's sufficient. Okay, so making sure you mature it to the fullest degree. So when you evaluate your safeguards, you're evaluating them against the potential consequence of not having your safeguard. And then you can make sure you have the right integrity level. I've had a question from Mohammed. In current economic conditions, do you see any impact in the job market for process safety professionals? Usually in a tough economic climate, process safety jobs may be compromised. What is your opinion? So yes, as with the previous question, in these times, what I see is that people try to cut money on the things that they think are not going to impact them in the next couple of years. And in general, you can cut a process safety resources for a good number of years before you have an incident. Or you may be very unlucky and cut the resources that very year and have the incident the same year. But in general, the reason why process safety is so tricky to manage, and the reason why we generally have waves of incidents, which was observed in the Marsh report in 2019. So about 18 months after a significant downturn, there is a wave of incidents. The reason for this is it takes time for those good process safety management systems to break down. So for example, if you have a system for managing your cathodic protection, and your frequency for inspecting that is every 6 months. If you then take out the people who are monitoring that cathodic protection, well, actually for the first 6 months, you're not going to see any change in your process safety performance, because actually they wouldn't even have looked at it for 6 months. But in the next 6 months, it hasn't been managed. And so therefore there's a potential that something has degraded. And then, by the third one, it's actually missed 2 cycles of inspections, and then you're starting to think maybe an incident could occur. So it's really about, yes, industry I've seen have cut process safety professionals at this time, but I have also seen an increased number of incidents as a result of the COVID lockdown last year. And also what I see in companies who have an incident, they place a large importance on process safety after the incident. So then all of a sudden there's lots of money for process safety to improve, to make sure they don't have this incident, which costs them a lot of money, maybe it's costing them a lot of money on their insurance. So it's kind of balancing out at the moment, but I definitely did see an impact just after the first lockdown. And I suspect that in the next 6 to 12 months, we'll see a significant uptake in the process safety services, because there will be a significant increase in incidents, unless we act now to prevent those. So Greg has another question. In every HAZOP or LOPA training I've attended, the principle of identifying the safety critical actions of instrumented safety functions is discussed as important. Yet my experience is that LOPA never identifies those actions, e.g. trips to the FCC. I'm in the US and I'm not interested to see if I'm just unlucky or if this is truly the norm. I have seen varying levels of LOPA analysis and also HAZOP analysis. I think you have to be really diligent and strict when you apply your HAZOP, and then also you have to be really structured when you're taking your scenarios from HAZOP to LOPA. I've seen 2 approaches for taking scenarios from HAZOP to LOPA. The first one is that you identify all the instrumented functions that you have taken credit for in the HAZOP, and you move those to LOPA. And the second approach is that you identify all the scenarios which have a severity above a certain level, and you take those to LOPA. The first approach is the one that I would strongly not recommend, because if you only identify the instrumented functions, then you are only looking at the systems which before the HAZOP you already identified as having some protection required. And so all you're doing is saying, okay, well, we knew exactly what we were doing before the HAZOP, and we could definitely not have missed anything. So only look at those instruments, and that's the end of the story. Whereas if you look at the scenarios which have a high severity potential, you are then able to potentially identify those scenarios which, hey, you might not have foreseen before the HAZOP. And your team doing their good job in the HAZOP, going through systematically line by line, have identified for you, but you're just passing by if you use the first method. The second problem I have seen with HAZOP and LOPA is that HAZOP is often seen as a tick box exercise, and so therefore the correct diligence in the HAZOP workshop is not applied. And what I'm saying here is you should be really following the principles from IEC 615. No, sorry, I have to give you the number after. But there's a HAZOP standard, and it specifically states certain things you should be looking at. One of them is all the consequences need to be matured without safeguards to the fullest extent. They also need to be documented fully for all the categories which you are going to be assessing LOPA against. So if you, as a company, assess LOPA against asset, people, environment, and reputation, then every scenario in your LOPA must have asset, environment, people, and reputation. Now, perhaps you might say, oh, no, we don't have any reputation, we don't have any asset, we only have people, and whatever, for each one will be different. But you need to assess all 4. And then you need to have a clear cutoff for when they are going to go forward to LOPA. And you need to be really systematic. I know HAZOP can be very tedious, and it's difficult to keep concentration, but you need to go line by line, item by item, and consider each item against each guide word. Okay, and try not, it's easy, but try not to take shortcuts, so that you make sure that you have really identified all your process hazards in your HAZOP, and then you have a good foundation for LOPA. The other thing I've seen with LOPA, again, if you watch the video from last month, which was on LOPA, is that people abuse the numbers game. So rather than looking at the initiating causes as they were identified in the HAZOP, they try to find the lowest common denominator, or they try to put in so many safeguards which maybe are not meeting all the requirements of LOPA: independence, auditable, effective, and maintainable. They're not meeting all of those, but they think that they need all these layers so that they can get to a good number. LOPA is not a numbers game. LOPA is about providing you a framework to more effectively manage your hazards. And so, Greg, I'm hoping that if you go into your next workshop and try and encourage the others in your workshop to take that mindset. LOPA is not about numbers. It is about giving you a framework for more adequately managing your risks and having constructive decisions about really complicated scenarios. So one of the papers from the ICME Hazards Conference this year was discussing whether it's appropriate for a group of people, say 5 to 10 people, to assess how likely it is that a major process safety incident may happen. Now, if you're thinking about people who've been in the industry for 30 years, if they're still around, they probably haven't seen a major process safety incident, because otherwise they wouldn't still be here, because they will have died from the major process safety incident, which had the potential to kill everybody on the facility. So the fact that they're still here means that they are very unlikely to have seen a major process safety incident. So if you ask them in the HAZOP, how likely is it that we kill 50 people on this facility? They're going to say, terribly unlikely. I've never seen it in all my years of operation, probably because they haven't. But does that mean that that type of scenario cannot happen at your facility? So LOPA is giving you that framework so that you can start to break these complicated scenarios down into small steps where you can actually think. So the question is, can I overspeed the pump? Yes, I can overspeed the pump. Okay, good. When I overspeed the pump, can the seal fail? Yes, it can, but it's not going to fail every time. Okay, well, is it 1 in 10, 1 in 5? And then we're starting to use industry data to try and get these numbers and then get to a constructive answer. And as you go through the scenario, you're breaking up things into smaller and smaller parts so that you can really understand the scenario. Greg's also wants to expand on his last question. I'm looking for more insight on identifying the safety critical actions to prevent a specific hazard. So trips, the FCC should say closes the slide valve or isolating feed, realizing the trip may execute numerous other actions. I'm only invited to LOPA about half the time, and I'm a sys engineer. So this comes down to your LOPA facilitator. Your LOPA facilitator should be using the criteria. Is it independent, effective, maintainable, auditable? And when you are documenting why you are taking credit for that safeguard, you need to be saying, it's independent of the cause. It's effective because I will detect, I will analyze, and I will do. And from detection to doing is less time than the process safety time to reach the hazard. So you need to make sure that it is effective. It is going to stop the bad thing happening in the time that you have to respond. So in the time that it takes the person to identify what the problem is. Now, if he has 150 alarms, it may take him a little longer than 5 seconds to realize that that one alarm is the thing that he needs to be looking at. So we normally take about 15 minutes. So it takes 15 minutes to identify and analyze. And then he needs to respond. So how long is it going to take him to respond? If he needs to send an operator into the field to respond to something, and they then need to take action, you need to consider how large your facility is, etc. And then all of that adds up to your process safety time. So I think, Greg, what you're missing here is that identify. So how am I going to identify the problem, right? Is it an operator watching an instrument in the field, which is an analog instrument? Or is it an automated alarm, which then triggers an operator to do something? Or is it a switch? So something trips, it sends a signal in, and then something else happens. So what is detecting is the first thing that you need to put in your preventative measure. Identify something to trip the FCC, right? And it needs to close the slide valve or isolating feed. So you need to say exactly what it does to prevent the hazard. If it needs to close several valves, or it needs to close 2 valves and open 1 valve, and it needs to do all of that within 30 seconds, otherwise we're going to blow up the plant. That needs to be really clear when you document the safeguards, and that's where your local facilitator should come into play. Okay. I haven't had any more questions either in the Q&A or in the chat. I'm going to leave the question floor open for 5 more minutes. If I don't get anything, we'll wrap the session up. But thank you guys very much for all your questions tonight. They've been really good questions. Some of the key pitfalls with applying your process safety management system is becoming overconfident. If you don't see an incident for a long time, you think that you've had really good performance, when actually that's not what your data is telling you. It's just telling you that all the holes in your Swiss cheese haven't lined up for that specific incident. Okay, so I'm going to present what's coming up next. And then I'm going to, I'll have a look to check in if there's any more questions. And if there's not, then I'll close the session. So sharing the screen, hopefully successful. Yeah. So next month, we're going to have a session on risk assessments. So I decided to run this session because quite often what has happened to me in the past is I've had somebody come with an MOC to me and they've said, does this need a HAZOP? And I say, no, it doesn't need a HAZOP. And then they walk away from me. And I'm like, yeah, it doesn't need a HAZOP, but it needs X, Y, Z. So just because it doesn't need the HAZOP, which is the most common, people perceive to be the most common process safety tool, doesn't mean that you don't need to be using a technique to identify, assess, and manage your risks. So what I'm doing next month is we're going to be covering risk assessments. I'm going to go through some of the different types of risk assessments, apply it to some examples, as we always do during the masterclass. And then in the Process Safety Forum on the 3rd of March, you can join me and ask me questions about which risk assessment technique I might use for different scenarios, or whatever you want, but about risk assessments. In the masterclass, we'll be applying it to 2 or 3 examples, and I'll be showing you the benefits and the pitfalls of using different techniques for different scenarios, and why maybe HAZOP is not the only solution. And also, even if you have done a HAZOP, perhaps you might want to do something else as well. Okay, I haven't had any more questions. Is anybody else on the line got any more questions about the about process safety management? Have you got anything to share about best practices at your facility, or what you've seen work really well? I strongly advocate the process in IEC 61511, but it doesn't cover every part of process safety management. It's just really looking at instrumented functions. Thanks for the feedback, Alan. Okay, well, if that's everything for tonight, then I'm going to close the session. Thank you again, everyone, for attending. It was a really good session, and I look forward to seeing you next month, maybe in the masterclass or definitely on the Process Safety Forum. And if you could just fill out the feedback questionnaire at the end, be really helpful, because that's the only way that I can improve these sessions. And you can